I heard my mother crying before opening my eyes, but it was not the wail of a parent terrified of losing a child. It was the calculated whisper of a woman timing the sale of my belongings before I woke up. I lay paralyzed in the intensive care unit while my parents auctioned off my life. They did not know one thing. Behind my kitchen is a secret door holding exactly what will destroy every lie they just built. My name is Autumn Greenwood. I am 34 years old. I am a self-made woman, a business owner, and the founder and sole owner of Hearth and Pine Studio, a high-end culinary development agency that builds commercial recipes and elite menus for luxury hospitality brands across the country. I built my empire from scratch, clawing my way up through grease-stained kitchens and boardrooms filled with executives who thought a woman belonged in the kitchen, not running the company. I am white, I am fiercely independent, and I am sharp enough to know that the world only gives you what you are willing to ruthlessly protect. But none of that sharpness could stop a biological time bomb, a ruptured gallbladder. Sepsis, a severe cascading blood infection that dragged me down into the suffocating depths of an intensive care unit. Now, I am floating in a dark, heavy ocean of medical sedation. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of a ventilator forces air into my lungs. The sharp scent of clinical bleach burns my nostrils. I cannot move my arms. I cannot twitch a finger. My eyelids are sealed shut, glued down by a profound, agonizing weakness. To the outside world, to the doctors checking my vitals every 2 hours, I am a tragic 34-year-old woman clinging to life by a fraying thread. But inside, my mind is pulling itself out of the fog. The anesthesia is breaking. The darkness is receding, replaced by the faint, filtered light pushing against my closed eyelids. Then, I hear it. It is not the sound of a mother weeping over her dying child. It is a whisper, dry and urgent, cutting through the ambient hum of the medical machinery. If she does not make it, everything needs to be handled immediately. We cannot afford probate dragging on for 18 months. We need to secure the assets before the state steps in. It is my mother, Elaine. Her tone is not laced with sorrow. It is laced with logistics. There is a terrifying pragmatism in her voice, a cold calculation that sends a shockwave of absolute clarity straight to my motionless heart. A man clears his throat. My father, Victor. His voice is a low, polished baritone, the kind of voice he uses when negotiating a predatory corporate lease agreement or sweet-talking a bank manager. I am aware, Elaine, Victor murmurs smoothly. I already spoke to the hospital legal liaison. We are filing for temporary power of attorney. They said it takes about 48 hours to clear the paperwork given her critical condition. Once we have the proxy, we can start liquidating the immediate assets to cover expenses. Expenses. The word hangs in the sterile air like a curse. I have premium commercial health insurance. My corporate emergency fund could cover a decade of intensive care. There are no expenses that require liquidating my life's work. I lie there, imprisoned in my own failing body, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated reality of my parents. They are not standing vigil. They are not praying for a medical miracle. They are vultures circling a body that has not even stopped breathing yet. They are measuring the curtains while the house is still on fire. They are preparing to profit from my death. My chest rises and falls with the mechanical rhythm of the machine, but my brain is firing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. A terrifying, icy logic washes over me, burning away the last remnants of the fevered delirium. I cannot speak to defend myself. I cannot raise a hand to slap the greed out of their mouths. But I do not need to. Because as my parents stand over my bed, tallying up the square footage of my home and the equity in my corporate studio, they are factoring in a version of my life that I merely allowed them to see. They do not know about the architecture of my survival. Behind my closed eyes, I do not see the hospital room. I see my sanctuary, my home in Charleston. More specifically, I see the heart of my empire, my kitchen. It is a sprawling, breathtaking space. Reclaimed antique brick, gleaming copper fixtures, a massive butcher block island where I have developed recipes that sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars to corporate food conglomerates. But the true masterpiece of that kitchen is not the professional grade stove or the custom ventilation hood. It is the dry goods pantry. Floor-to-ceiling shelves built from dark walnut, stacked with imported spices, aged vinegars, and artisanal flours. To anyone else, it is a chef's paradise. To me, it is a brilliantly disguised vault. If you press firmly against the heavy wooden paneling just behind the third tier of shelving, a silent, magnetized lock disengages. The wall slides back, revealing a climate-controlled, fireproof preservation room that I restored entirely off the books when I bought the property. My parents think my wealth is scattered across bank accounts they can freeze and real estate they can quickly flip. They have no idea what rests in the quiet dark of that hidden room. In that secret space lies the actual foundation of Hearth and Pine Studio. There are the original intellectual property filings for every recipe, every brand deal, every corporate contract I have ever signed. There are the corporate ledger books detailing the exact boundaries of my wealth, shielding my company from any hostile takeover, especially from blood relatives who view my success as their personal pension plan. More importantly, there is a heavy fireproof lockbox. Inside that box is the original, notarized copy of my grandmother June's will. The document detailing my inheritance that my parents told the courts went missing 10 years ago. It is the very document that proves they have zero legal claim to her legacy or my current empire. Next to it sits an encrypted offline hard drive containing a meticulous digital trail of every corporate transaction I have ever made, completely isolated from any cloud server they might try to hack. And finally, resting on top of the drive, is a thick, sealed manila envelope. Across the front, written in my own steady handwriting, are the words, "To be opened only in the event of betrayal." The irony is almost poetic. My parents stand beside my hospital bed, looking down at a body hooked up to tubes and wires, thinking they are staring at an easy mark. They see a helpless, incapacitated woman who worked herself into the ground to build an empire they are about to casually steal. They think they hold all the cards, because I cannot move my mouth to tell them to stop. They do not realize that in their haste to strip me down to the bone, they are dealing with a woman who spent the last 15 years building a fortress precisely to keep them out. They are standing before the most dangerous person in the room, a woman backed into a corner, armed with the truth, and fueled by a lifetime of their subtle, suffocating betrayals. A nurse enters the room. Her rubber soles squeak against the linoleum floor. "Her vitals are stabilizing," the nurse says brightly. "Her heart rate has been steady for the last 30 minutes. "Oh, thank God," my mother gasps. It is a brilliant performance. If I could open my eyes, I am sure I would see tears trembling on her lashes. "We have been so terrified. Just keep resting, sweetheart," my father says, stepping closer to the bed. I feel the heavy, warm weight of his hand rest on my cold arm. It takes every ounce of willpower I possess not to flinch from his touch. It feels like the grip of a debt collector. I remain perfectly still. I let the machine breathe for me. I let my face remain a slack, emotionless mask of critical illness. I will let them believe I am broken. I will let them dig their hands deep into the illusion of my life, letting them commit every fraud, sign every fraudulent document, and expose exactly who they are to the world. Let them get comfortable in their theft. The higher they climb on the ladder of my supposed demise, the harder the inevitable fall will be. The sedatives begin to pull me back under, dragging my consciousness back toward the dark water of sleep. But I'm not fighting it anymore. I know exactly what I need to do when the time comes. I did not wake up in a panic. I woke up to memorize every voice. In the stifling darkness of my medically induced twilight, the past rushes in to fill the silence. It is funny how a fever strips away the polite fiction of family. Growing up a Greenwood meant learning very early that love was never a gift. Love was a line of credit with an exorbitant interest rate, and my parents were relentless debt collectors. In their house, a child was not a person. A child was an asset, a shiny trophy to be polished for the neighbors and pawned when times got tough. My mother, Elaine, was the architect of our suburban illusion. She was a woman entirely consumed by the pursuit of the perfect image. She spent thousands of dollars we did not have on tailored country club dresses and manicured lawns, projecting a life of effortless wealth. Behind closed doors, she was frantic, tallying up social slights and measuring our worth by how well we made her look. My father, Victor, was the enforcer. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. He was a man who spoke in soft, reasonable tones while ruthlessly dismantling your self-esteem. He was a financial predator in a cashmere sweater, viewing every relationship through the lens of leverage and return on investment. If I won a regional baking competition, the victory belonged to them. If I worked a summer job, my wages magically disappeared into the household fund to cover their bad investments. The breaking point came the summer I turned 18. I had spent 4 years grinding through high school, bleeding over textbooks and burning my hands in commercial kitchens, all to secure a prestigious culinary arts scholarship. It was my ticket out. It covered tuition, board, and a stipend. It was worth tens of thousands of dollars. The night the acceptance letter arrived, Victor sat me down at the dining table. He poured himself a measure of expensive scotch and, in that soft, terrifyingly reasonable voice, informed me that I would be declining the offer. His latest business venture was hemorrhaging money. He needed me to stay home, work full-time at his failing warehouse for zero pay, and help save the family. Elaine sat next to him, dabbing her dry eyes, telling me that a loyal daughter would not abandon her parents in their hour of need. They did not ask. They demanded my future as collateral for their failures. That night, I packed 2 canvas duffel bags, took the $42 I had hidden in a hollowed-out book, and walked out into the humid Carolina darkness. I never went back. The years that followed were a masterclass in survival. I did not just learn how to cook. I learned how to bleed for a paycheck. I started out ghostwriting cheap, generic recipes for internet blogs at $5 a piece. I worked 3 different prep cook jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night on a mattress I pulled from a dumpster. Every time I felt like collapsing, I thought of my father and his soft voice telling me I owed him my life. That anger was a furnace. It kept me moving. Slowly, painfully, I built my studio. I transitioned from writing cheap blog posts to consulting for struggling restaurants, then to developing commercial cookbooks, and finally to crafting exclusive menus for luxury hospitality brands. I became the ghost in the machine of the high-end culinary world. I learned the brutal language of corporate contracts, intellectual property, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. By the time I turned 30, I was a millionaire. I bought my home in Charleston entirely in cash. It was a beautiful, historic property that needed extensive renovation, but I saw its bones. The kitchen, with its massive footprint, became the beating heart of my life. I poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into customizing it, but the hidden room behind the pantry was never some silly theatrical thriller trope. It was a necessity born of trauma. The original blueprints of the house included a 19th century cold storage preservation room. Instead of knocking it down, I reinforced it. I spent a fortune outfitting it with fireproof insulation, climate control, and a magnetized lock. The corporate world had taught me that business is cutthroat, but my childhood had taught me that family is infinitely worse. I learned that paper is armor. He who holds the original documents holds the power. I needed a vault that no one, absolutely no one, knew about. The only person who would have understood the necessity of that hidden room was my grandmother, June Calloway. She was the only adult in my bloodline who ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of a tool. She saw right through Victor and Elaine. When she passed away, she bypassed my parents entirely. She left me her worn cast-iron skillets, her leather-bound journals filled with generations of Appalachian recipes, her antique emerald jewelry, and a very specific set of legal instructions. But more importantly, she left me a warning. I can still hear her gravelly voice, weakened by age but sharp with wisdom. She told me that Victor and Elaine would smile when I was standing tall, but the second I stumbled, they would be the first to pick my pockets. For a brief, foolish window of time, I thought she might be wrong. When my company hit 7 figures, my parents suddenly reappeared. They were polite. They invited me to expensive dinners. They posted glowing tributes to my success on their social media accounts, claiming my victories as the result of their excellent parenting. I let myself believe that time and distance had healed them. I hoped that seeing me as an independent, wealthy adult had finally earned me their respect. I was an idiot. They had not changed. They had not grown. They had simply adjusted their strategy. They recognized that I was no longer a frightened teenager they could bully. So they became patient. They stood outside the walls of my life, acting like friendly neighbors, just waiting for the drawbridge to lower. And now, this. The bitter, suffocating irony of it all burns worse than the sepsis in my blood. I spent 16 long, grueling years engineering my entire existence so I would never have to depend on them for a single breath. I paid for everything in cash. I held zero personal debt. I structured my corporate entities to be impregnable. I designed my life to be a fortress of absolute autonomy. Yet, one biological failure, one microscopic infection that ruptured my gallbladder, has undone 16 years of running. A simple medical emergency has dragged me right back to the one place I swore I would never be again. I am helpless, voiceless, and entirely at their mercy. My illness did not just put me in a hospital bed, it put them right back in the driver's seat of my life, exactly where they always believed they belonged. While I lay trapped in the sterile hum of the intensive care unit, a dark, frantic energy took hold of the world outside my hospital room. With the stroke of a pen on a temporary medical proxy, my parents legally transformed themselves into my saviors. To the doctors, they were the grieving, devoted guardians making agonizing decisions. But the moment they stepped out of the hospital's sliding doors, they weaponized that proxy. They began to dismantle my life with the chilling efficiency of a demolition crew. They carefully cultivated a narrative of impending tragedy. They spoke in hushed, trembling voices to my neighbors over the wrought iron gates of my property. They fielded panicked phone calls from my corporate clients, sighing heavily into the receiver. They flooded social media with vague, devastating updates, heavily implying that I was unlikely to survive the week. The cornerstone of their story was sacrifice. They told everyone who would listen that they were being forced to make heartbreaking choices, liquidating my beloved assets just to keep the hospital machines pumping air into my failing lungs. It was a brilliantly constructed, thoroughly documented lie. The truth was quietly sitting in the hospital's billing department. My commercial health insurance was a premium corporate tier. The policy had immediately kicked in, covering 95% of the surgical emergency and the extended intensive care stay. My total out-of-pocket maximum was a fraction of what I kept in a standard checking account. My parents were informed of this coverage within the first 48 hours of my admission. They looked at the zero balance estimate, folded the paperwork, and deliberately buried it. With the false specter of crippling medical debt shielding them, the looting began. They did not merely pack up a few belongings, they stripped my Charleston home to the bone. While I was receiving intravenous antibiotics, they hired a cut-rate moving crew to clear out the house. They took my imported French copper cookware. They boxed up my custom-forged Japanese chef knives, tools I had spent years acquiring. They pulled the oil paintings from the hallways, dismantled the custom mahogany wine racks in the cellar, and hauled away the massive 14-seat farmhouse dining table where I hosted client tastings. The deepest cut, the one that proved their absolute lack of boundaries, was when they took the worn wooden boxes holding my grandmother's handwritten recipe cards. They treated my sanctuary like an estate sale for a corpse that had not yet gone cold. Victor, operating with the ruthless speed of a corporate raider, moved on to the real estate. He contacted a luxury broker known for handling off-market, cash-heavy transactions. He listed my beautifully restored, historic home at a staggering discount, engineering a flash fire sale. He looked the broker in the eye and claimed the family required immediate, massive liquidity to fund experimental, out-of-state medical treatments for me. He pushed to close the deal in under 21 days, desperate to secure the cash before I could potentially wake up and stop him. Meanwhile, Elaine recognized that sympathy was a highly monetizable asset. She launched a massive online crowdfunding campaign. She hired a local videographer and stood right in the middle of my kitchen, the very kitchen her hired crews were actively gutting off camera. She looked directly into the lens, her makeup perfectly smudged to convey the exhaustion of a vigilant mother, and wept. She told thousands of strangers that they were sacrificing their own retirement, selling off everything they owned, just to give their daughter a fighting chance. The internet responded exactly as she hoped. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured in from sympathetic strangers, industry peers, and loyal blog followers. Every single dollar bypassed my accounts and funneled directly into a new, private bank account Elaine had established in her own name. But their greed blinded them to the limits of their temporary authority. They stumbled across an old, unanswered inquiry in my business files from Granby Fair Company, a massive, mid-tier food distributor I had previously rejected for poor quality control. Bypassing my retained corporate counsel entirely, Victor and Elaine used the medical proxy to sign a sweeping licensing agreement. They granted Granby temporary, exclusive commercial rights to Hearth and Pine Studios' top-performing recipe portfolios. In exchange, Granby wired a massive, six-figure cash advance. But they did not route the funds into my corporate holding accounts. They directed the corporate wire transfer straight into their personal joint checking account. It was a breathtaking display of unchecked gluttony, but it was also profoundly stupid. They operated under the assumption that all my wealth was sitting in a single, accessible pile. They did not know that my financial architecture was a labyrinth. I strictly maintained impenetrable legal walls between my personal checking, my limited liability corporate entities, and the estate I inherited from my grandmother. By crossing those legally distinct boundaries, by selling inherited property, liquidating personal assets, and signing binding corporate contracts with a purely medical proxy, they were not just making a single mistake. They were braiding a noose of multi-jurisdictional felonies. They were simultaneously committing wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate malfeasance. They were so frantic to harvest the visible fruits of my labor that they missed the roots entirely. They walked through my home, calculating the resale value of every fixture and appliance, but they only saw a beautiful, empty room. They sold the copper, the wood, the art, and the steel. But because they lacked imagination, because they never truly understood the depth of my paranoia regarding them, they never looked closer. They never pressed their hands against the dark walnut paneling. They left the false wall behind the pantry completely untouched. Waking up felt like clawing my way through wet concrete. The transition from the medically induced void to conscious reality was not graceful. It was a violent collision of sensory input. My throat felt as though it had been scoured with broken glass, courtesy of the ventilator tube they had finally removed. Every joint in my body screamed with a dull, throbbing ache, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit burned right through my retinas. The calendar on the wall blurred into focus, telling me it had been 14 days since my gallbladder betrayed me. 14 days of silence. 14 days of my life being dismantled piece by piece. Despite the physical wreckage, my mind was terrifyingly sharp. The fever had broken, and the heavy fog of the sedatives was rapidly burning off. I lay still, regulating my breathing, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Elaine was sitting in the corner armchair when I finally let my eyes stay open. The moment she noticed the shift in my breathing, she leaped up, her face instantly rearranging itself into a mask of pure, martyred devotion. She rushed to the bedside, grasping my limp hand between both of hers. Her skin was warm and soft, heavily scented with expensive floral lotion. "Oh, my sweet girl," Elaine whispered, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "You are back with us. We were so terrified. We thought we were going to lose you." I did not pull away. I let my hand lie dead in hers. I forced my eyes to remain half-closed, projecting an image of total exhaustion. I needed her to believe that the woman in this bed was thoroughly broken, completely dependent, and fundamentally incapable of fighting back. "Mom," I rasped. My voice sounded weak, brittle, and foreign. It was the perfect disguise. "Shh, do not try to speak," she soothed, brushing a damp strand of hair from my forehead. "You just focus on healing. Your father and I have taken care of everything. We had to make some incredibly difficult choices to make sure your medical needs were met without destroying your future. We sold the house. We had to downsize your belongings to ease the financial burden. But do not worry about any of that now. We are handling it." The audacity of her gentle tone was breathtaking. She was presenting the systematic looting of my empire as an act of maternal sacrifice. A younger version of me, the teenager who had run away into the Carolina night, would have exploded. I would have screamed, ripped the intravenous line from my arm, and demanded answers. But the woman in this bed was a seasoned corporate survivor. I knew that anger was a liability, information was power. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh. I allowed a single tear to slip down my cheek. "Thank you," I whispered, injecting every ounce of manufactured vulnerability into the words. "I am just so tired. I feel so lost." Elaine beamed, a triumphant glint flashing in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart. We are here. We have total control." Victor walked into the room a few minutes later, carrying a cup of lukewarm hospital coffee. He played his part perfectly, kissing my forehead and murmuring words of quiet strength. I played the grateful, incapacitated daughter for another hour until the nurses came to change my dressings. When my parents prepared to leave for the evening, I made my move. "Dad," I murmured, my voice shaking just enough, "can you bring my phone and my tablet tomorrow? I do not want to talk to anyone. I just want to look at old photos. The silence in here is making me anxious. I just want to look at pictures of the garden." It was a calculated request. If I had asked for my laptop or mentioned work, Victor would have instantly grown suspicious and locked down my devices. But asking to look at pictures of a garden that fit their narrative, that was the request of a weak, sentimental woman seeking comfort. Victor smiled indulgently, patted my shoulder, and promised to bring them. They delivered the devices the next morning. I waited until the night shift took over. At 11 o'clock at night, when the corridor went completely quiet and the only light in my room was the faint glow of the monitors, I propped myself up against the pillows. I ignored the screaming pain in my abdomen. I picked up the tablet, I bypassed the standard apps, and immediately opened a secure, encrypted browser, logging into my private off-site server. The digital carnage was worse than I had imagined. I found Elaine's crowdfunding video almost immediately. It had gone viral across the culinary network. I sat in the dark hospital room and watched my mother stand in my kitchen, squeezing out crocodile tears, begging the world to help her save my life. The campaign total sat at $342,000. Every single cent of it was sitting in a trust that I did not control. I switched tabs and pulled up my secure corporate email interface. The inbox was a disaster zone. There were dozens of panicked emails from my top 3 clients. They were confused and angry about erratic messages sent from my primary address, an address Victor had clearly hijacked. Then, I found the scanned PDF of the temporary licensing agreement with Granby Fair Company. I read the contract line by line. It was an absolute mess. Victor had used his medical proxy to sign away intellectual property he did not legally understand. The terms were predatory, but the execution was flawed. The agreement showed glaring signs of invalidity. It cited the wrong corporate entity and overstepped the bounds of a purely medical power of attorney. Legally, I could tear it to shreds in a courtroom. However, the public relations damage was a ticking time bomb. If Granby started manufacturing my recipes and the quality was poor, my studio's elite reputation would be destroyed before I ever got in front of a judge. It had to be neutralized quietly and quickly. Finally, I opened the local real estate listings. I typed in the address of my Charleston home. It popped up immediately, labeled as sold. The listing featured 40 high-resolution photographs of the property. I clicked through the gallery, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw the empty living room, the stripped cellar, and then The kitchen. I zoomed in on the fourth picture. I dragged my finger across the screen until the right side of the image filled the display. I stared at the dark walnut shelves of the dry goods pantry. I looked past the empty spaces where my spice jars used to sit. I focused entirely on the decorative wood trim running along the edge of the third tier. The trim was perfectly flush. The microscopic seam in the paneling was undisturbed. The heavy wood had not been pried, scratched, or forced. I let out a long, shuddering breath. The secret door had not been discovered. The vault was safe. The original documents, the encrypted ledgers, and my grandmother's will were exactly where I left them. I powered down the tablet and slipped it under my pillow. I lay back in the darkness, staring at the ceiling tiles. I had enough evidence right now to call the authorities and have Victor and Elaine arrested for fraud. I could end it tonight, but I closed my eyes and smiled. A cold, hard line forming on my face. Confident criminals always make the worst mistakes when they think nobody is watching. If I struck now, they would claim it was a misunderstanding. They would hire expensive defense attorneys and drag me through years of litigation. I needed them to feel invincible. I needed them to spend the stolen money, sign more fraudulent papers, and dig a hole so deep that they could never climb out. I would not say a word yet. I was going to let them keep digging. The day the hospital finally discharged me, Victor and Elaine had a meticulously staged homecoming waiting. They had prepared the guest bedroom in their newly leased condominium, fully intending to keep their incapacitated daughter under lock and key while they finished draining her accounts. I never showed up. While they were busy coordinating a welcome banner for their social media followers, I slipped out the side exit of the medical center and stepped into a hired black car. I did not go to them. I went to a fully furnished, short-term executive apartment I had leased the night before using a secondary corporate entity they knew nothing about. It was a sterile, high-rise box of glass and steel, completely devoid of charm, but it had a heavy deadbolt and secured elevator access. It was the perfect war room. Within 2 hours of dropping my duffel bag on the floor, I began assembling the firing squad. My first call was to Mara Bell. She was not the kind of attorney who advertised on highway billboards. She was a ghost in the legal community, a terrifyingly precise litigator specializing in the intersection of intellectual property and complex estate law. She did not operate on emotion. She operated on leverage. I gave her the broad strokes of the medical proxy abuse and the fraudulent licensing. She accepted the retainer before I even finished the sentence. Simultaneously, I contracted an independent forensic accounting firm. I needed them to map the exact trajectory of every single stolen dollar. I gave them authorization to trace the crowdfunding deposits, dissect my parents' joint and individual bank routing numbers, and locate the massive cash advance Granby Fair Company had recklessly wired. I needed a watertight paper trail proving that the money raised under the guise of my medical salvation had been diverted for their personal enrichment. But the legal and financial maneuvering meant nothing without the contents of my vault. I needed to get back inside my Charleston house. A lesser strategist would have simply knocked on the front door and confronted the new owner. That would have been a disaster resulting in trespassing charges and a tipped hand. In American real estate, you do not fight the current resident. You fight the paperwork. I targeted the title insurance company. I filed a formal, expedited grievance stating that the property had been sold with a severe disclosure violation. I cited the existence of a concealed, unpermitted structural void that had been deliberately omitted from the seller's documentation. The threat of an uninsurable title is the nuclear option in a real estate transaction. Within 48 hours, the title company mandated an emergency, on-site inspection. That is how I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside my own home on a brisk Tuesday morning. The new owner was waiting on the porch. His name was Nolan Pierce, a wealthy anesthesiologist who had purchased the historic property in cash, envisioning a peaceful vacation retreat. He looked utterly bewildered, holding a manila folder and flanked by an anxious title insurance agent. Nolan had no idea he had just walked into the middle of a massive financial crime. He unlocked the front door and let us in. Walking through those halls felt like visiting a graveyard. The space was stripped of its soul, echoing and hollow. But I kept my face blank, leaning slightly on a walking cane I did not actually need. Playing the part of the recovering previous owner just trying to clear up a structural misunderstanding, I led them straight to the kitchen. It felt violating to see my professional sanctuary so empty, but I focused on the task. I walked past the marble island and stepped into the sprawling dry goods pantry. Nolan and the agent watched me closely. I reached up to the walnut paneling directly behind the third shelf. I pressed my palm flat against the wood, applying pressure to the exact sequence of pressure points. A heavy magnetic click echoed in the quiet room. Nolan jumped back as the solid wall smoothly and silently tracked to the left, revealing the dark, climate-controlled preservation room. The title agent audibly gasped, immediately scribbling furiously on his clipboard. I stepped over the threshold into the cool, dry air of the vault. It was completely untouched. To anyone else, the metal shelving and lockboxes might have looked like a paranoid survivalist bunker, but this was my arsenal. I did not touch the heavy canvas bags holding emergency cash reserves. Cash is untraceable, and therefore useless in a court of law. I went straight for the fireproof filing cabinets. I pulled out the original, notarized copy of June Calloway's last will and testament. I gathered the certified trademark registrations for Hearth and Pine Studio, the foundational articles of incorporation, and the meticulously updated physical asset logs that cataloged every antique and piece of equipment Victor and Elaine had illegally fenced. I grabbed the encrypted offline hard drive containing the mirrored backups of my corporate servers. Finally, my eyes landed on the thick envelope resting on the top shelf, the one with my own handwriting warning me to open it only in the event of familial betrayal. I slipped it into my leather satchel alongside the other documents. I was careful to leave the room looking exactly as I found it. I left the empty decoy binders and the cash. I needed the space to look like an abandoned storage closet, not a plundered safe. If I took everything, my parents could try to claim I had staged the entire room after the fact to frame them, the structure itself, and the fact that they clearly knew nothing about it during the sale was the proof I needed. As I zipped my satchel, my fingers brushed against a thin, dusty folder tucked between two steel dividers. I pulled it out. It was a file I had not looked at in nearly a decade. I flipped it open, scanning the yellowing pages under the dim overhead light. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. It was a legally binding settlement agreement from 14 years ago. My grandmother, June, had meticulously drafted it. The document proved that Victor and Elaine had been drowning in insurmountable consumer debt. June had agreed to liquidate a portion of her own retirement to pay off their creditors and save them from bankruptcy, but she made them sign a contract in return. In exchange for the financial bailout, both Victor and Elaine had legally renounced any and all future claims, rights of intervention, or conservatorship over my personal inheritance and estate. They had traded their right to touch my money for a quick payout over a decade ago. They had violated a legally binding renunciation. They had committed perjury the moment they stepped into the hospital's legal office and claimed authority over my assets. I closed the file and slid it into my bag. I stepped out of the vault, allowing the heavy wall to slide shut and lock behind me. Nolan Pierce was staring at me, realizing the sheer magnitude of the liability he had just purchased. I gave him a polite nod, walked out of my stolen house, and climbed into my waiting car. The siege was over. The annihilation was about to begin. Back in the sterile executive apartment, the real work began. Mara Bell did not just read the documents I brought from the vault. She weaponized them. She spread the articles of incorporation, the trademark certificates, and the 14-year-old settlement agreement across the glass dining table. In less than 48 hours, Mara reconstructed the impenetrable legal firewalls I had spent over a decade building. She drew absolute, unyielding lines between Hearth and Pine Studio, my personal bank accounts, and the untouched inheritance left by my grandmother. While Mara built the cage, the independent forensic accountant traced the bait. His preliminary report on Elaine's tear-jerking online fundraiser was a masterpiece of suburban grift. Of the massive sum raised under the banner of my supposed medical insolvency, not a single cent had been routed to the hospital's billing department. Instead, the accountant tracked a large wire transfer used to instantly zero out Elaine's high-interest platinum credit cards. Another substantial chunk had quietly paid off a lingering loan on a used recreational vehicle Victor had purchased 3 years prior. The most damning transaction, however, was a massive cashier's check issued for a 30% down payment on a luxury waterfront condominium. They were literally buying a new life with the funds meant to save mine. With the financial map secured, I began pulling the tripwires. The first strike was aimed at Granby Fair Company. I did not call their executives to argue or plead my case. Mara simply dispatched a comprehensive legal notice directly to their corporate counsel via certified courier. The binder contained my sole proprietorship documentation, the active trademark registrations for every recipe they thought they had purchased, and a stark legal clarification of a medical proxy's absolute lack of corporate authority. The effect was immediate. My industry contacts later whispered that Granby's legal department descended into absolute chaos. Realizing they had just wired a 6-figure cash advance to 2 individuals who possessed zero equity in the brand. Next, we hit the crowdfunding platform. Mara bypassed their automated customer service bots and filed a direct emergency injunction with their corporate compliance officers. We demanded an immediate freeze on the remaining funds sitting in the campaign's reserve. More importantly, we invoked a preservation hold on the entire digital footprint of the fundraiser. Every update Elaine posted, every comment she replied to, and every withdrawal she authorized was locked down and archived as evidence of wire fraud. The third wire belonged to Nolan Pierce and his title insurance company. I forwarded the architectural blueprints proving the existence of the unpermitted vault, along with the old renunciation contract where Victor and Elaine had legally forfeited any right to my estate. I turned that historic Charleston house from a charming vacation home into a radioactive legal hazard. By dropping that paperwork onto the underwriter's desk, I guaranteed that the title company, backed by their own massive legal team, would have no choice but to hunt down Victor and Elaine for criminal misrepresentation and title fraud in order to recoup their massive financial liabilities. I was successfully pitting my parents against a multi-million-dollar insurance conglomerate. Despite the fury of these legal maneuvers, I knew a business is only as strong as its relationships. I quietly arranged secure video calls with the 3 most lucrative clients on Hearth and Pine Studios' roster. I did not look like a victim during those meetings. I wore a tailored blazer, sat up straight despite the lingering abdominal pain, and delivered a surgically precise explanation. I informed them that while I was incapacitated in the intensive care unit, estranged family members had attempted a fraudulent assumption of my brand. I assured them the breach was contained and their proprietary menus were secure. Instead of canceling their contracts out of fear, all 3 executives were so impressed by the ruthless efficiency of the cleanup that they not only stayed, but eagerly agreed to provide sworn affidavits confirming I had always operated the studio entirely independent of my parents. Then, the universe delivered an unexpected gift. An encrypted email arrived from a woman who used to be my mother's personal assistant. Someone who had quit 2 years ago citing a toxic work environment. She had seen the viral video of Elaine weeping in my kitchen and felt sick to her stomach. Attached to the email was a forwarded voicemail Elaine had left on her phone just days after I was admitted to the hospital. I pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the quiet apartment. There were no tears in the recording. She sounded breathless, practically giddy with power. "Cancel the caterer for the garden club next week," Elaine's voice commanded sharply over the audio file. "We are dealing with a crisis. Autumn is in critical condition." But honestly, if she does not wake up, consider it a hard reset. Everything goes right back to the family where it belongs, and we are finally going to handle things the right way. It was the smoking gun. Pure, unadulterated malice captured in high-definition audio. Through all of this, I maintained a total digital blackout. I did not post a single reassuring picture on social media. I did not issue a press release. I let my account sit in dead silence. To Victor and Elaine, my silence validated their narrative. They assumed I was still too weak, too cognitively impaired, or too emotionally shattered to comprehend what they had done. Their hubris fed on my absence because they thought they had already won. They kept spending the stolen money. They kept giving interviews to local food bloggers about their tragic burden. They kept expanding the blast radius of their own inevitable destruction. I sat alone at the glass dining table as the city lights flickered to life outside the window. The heavy manila envelope I had carried out of the vault rested exactly in the center of the table. The words I had written years ago stared back at me, to be opened only in the event of betrayal. I reached out and traced the edge of the seal with my index finger. I knew whatever June had left in there was the kill shot, but a sniper does not pull the trigger just because the rifle is loaded. You wait for the wind to die down. You wait for the target to step fully out into the open, completely exposed, smiling at the crowd. I pulled my hand back and left the envelope sealed. Not yet. The dominoes began to fall with deafening speed. Granby Fair Company did not merely back out of the temporary licensing agreement. Their legal department went scorched earth. After reviewing the binder Mara Bell sent, Granby dispatched a blistering cease and desist directly to Victor and Elaine. The notice was entirely devoid of professional courtesy. It threatened a massive countersuit against my parents for gross misrepresentation, fraud, and breach of contract, demanding the immediate return of the six-figure cash advance plus punitive damages. Granby realized they had been duped by two amateurs, and they were preparing to crucify them. Simultaneously, Nolan Pierce realized the severity of his exposure. The anesthesiologist recognized that if the title fraud case blew up into a public scandal, his ownership of the historic property would be tied up in litigation for years. He pivoted from a bewildered bystander to a highly motivated ally. His attorneys contacted Mara, and together they forged an informal coalition. Nolan aimed his considerable legal resources, backed by the enraged title insurance conglomerate, straight at the people who had sold him a lie. Victor and Elaine were suddenly surrounded by massive corporate entities demanding their pound of flesh. The pressure cracked their polished facade. The public narrative of the grieving, heroic parents vanished, replaced by desperate, frantic backpedaling. My phone began to buzz with lengthy, rambling voicemails. They stopped talking about sacrifices and started talking about family loyalty. They pleaded with me not to destroy the family name over what they casually termed a few paperwork misunderstandings. Then, Victor tried to play his final, pathetic card. He bypassed my lawyer and sent a direct, encrypted email proposing a backdoor settlement. He offered to wire back 50% of the cash they had taken. In exchange, he demanded I withdraw the title dispute, kill the Granby investigation, and issue a joint public statement claiming the entire ordeal was simply a hasty, well-intentioned medical emergency liquidation. He wanted me to buy my own stolen life back at a 50% discount and hand him a public pardon. I agreed to a face-to-face meeting at Mara Bell's downtown office. I had no intention of accepting his deal, but I needed to look them in the eye and document their exact emotional state. When they walked into the conference room, they looked 10 years older. Victor's usual bespoke suit looked slightly rumpled, and the confident, reasonable tone he had used to control me my entire life was replaced by a tight, reedy anxiety. Elaine was worse. Her perfect hair was flat, and her eyes darted nervously around the mahogany room. I sat perfectly still across the table, letting Mara do the talking. The silence unnerved them. As Mara calmly laid out the criminal implications of their corporate forgery, Elaine finally snapped. Her manicured hands slammed onto the table. "We were trying to protect the legacy," Elaine shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "The doctors told us the sepsis could cause permanent cognitive decline. We thought you were going to be a vegetable. Someone had to take the wheel. I was just helping transition the company to responsible adults before the brand lost all its market value." Mara stopped speaking. She slowly picked up her pen and noted the time. Elaine had just confessed, in a room with a licensed attorney and a running digital transcript, that she had intentionally orchestrated a hostile takeover of my assets based on the assumption of my permanent mental incompetence. Victor grabbed his wife's arm. his face draining of blood as he realized what she had just done. But the words were already out. As if that disastrous meeting was not enough. My forensic accountant called me an hour later with a fresh discovery. The financial rot went deeper than the house and the business contracts. My parents had leveraged my name to sell a future I had never agreed to. They had actively promoted a phantom charity cooking gala, promising my triumphant, miraculous return to the kitchen. They had pre-sold hundreds of premium tickets to high society donors and local food critics, charging thousands of dollars per seat. The event did not exist. The venue was never booked. It was a spectacular, breathtaking cash grab, entirely dependent on me either playing along or being too dead to object. I returned to my secure apartment that evening. The city outside was loud, but my living room was completely silent. I walked over to the glass dining table. I stared at the sealed manila envelope. The time for waiting was over. I slid a letter opener beneath the heavy adhesive and broke the seal. Inside was a single, folded piece of thick stationery and a notarized legal document. I unfolded the handwritten letter first. The ink was faded, but my grandmother June's sharp, looping cursive was unmistakable. The letter was dated exactly 2 weeks before she died. She wrote that she knew Victor and Elaine better than they knew themselves. She predicted that their greed was a dormant virus, waiting for my immune system to drop. She warned me that one day, when I was at my absolute weakest, they would try to strip the flesh from my bones and call it love. Then, I read the attached legal document. It was a strictly confidential, conditional codicil to her original will. June had not just left me her assets. She had laid a trap. The codicil explicitly stated that if any blood relative attempted to exploit my physical or mental incapacitation to seize, transfer, or profit from my estate, a brutal legal mechanism would automatically trigger. Victor and Elaine still technically held a minor, deferred trust from June's wider family estate, a fund they were banking on for their late-stage retirement. The codicil dictated that the moment they committed an act of financial exploitation against me, their beneficiary status was permanently revoked. Every single dollar of their deferred trust would instantly default to my sole ownership. It was a poison pill of epic proportions. It was not just an insurance policy. It was a weapon of mass financial destruction. I sat back in my chair, the heavy parchment resting in my hands. The game had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a simple mission to recover my stolen house, my bank accounts, or my business reputation. Recouping the money was just arithmetic. What June had given me was the power to execute a total, scorched earth demolition of the moral high ground my parents had spent 30 years cultivating. They were about to lose everything they had stolen, everything they currently owned, and everything they thought they were going to get. The trap was fully set. All I had to do was let them step onto the stage they had built for themselves. Elaine did not retreat, like a cornered animal. She doubled down on the only strategy she knew: public manipulation. On a Tuesday morning, a new video surfaced on her social media channels. The lighting was dramatic, her expression perfectly calibrated to project a mother's exhaustion and heartbreak. She looked directly into the camera and softly suggested that I was not myself. She used phrases like ICU delirium and post-traumatic cognitive instability. She heavily implied that predatory lawyers were taking advantage of my fragile mental state to tear our loving family apart. It was a preemptive strike, designed to paint me as a paranoid, hysterical woman whose accusations could not be trusted. My first instinct was not anger, it was strategy. A lesser person would have immediately posted a furious rebuttal video, feeding into the exact narrative Elaine was trying to build. I did not say a word to the internet. Instead, within exactly 1 hour of that video going live, I walked into the premier neurological assessment center at the State Medical University. I subjected myself to a grueling, 4-hour independent cognitive and psychiatric evaluation administered by 3 top-tier neurospecialists. I completed memory tests, logic puzzles, and psychological profiling. By the end of the afternoon, I walked out with a certified, notarized medical document declaring me operating at 100% cognitive capacity, exhibiting exceptional executive function, and displaying absolutely zero signs of trauma-induced psychosis. I armored my mind with medical science before Elaine could successfully turn it into a weapon. With my mental competency legally bulletproof, Mara Bell unleashed the legal blitzkrieg. She marched into the district courthouse and filed an emergency injunction. The judge took one look at the mountain of evidence and immediately granted a sweeping order stripping Victor and Elaine of any remaining proxy powers. The order legally barred them from acting on my behalf in any capacity regarding my assets, my corporate brand, any fundraising efforts, or making any public statements concerning my medical history. But Mara did not stop at the courthouse. She executed a synchronized corporate strike. On the exact same morning, devastating legal preservation letters landed on the desks of the crowdfunding platform's legal team, the title insurance underwriters, Granby Fair Company, and two prominent local auction houses. It was a calculated domino effect. The letters mandated the immediate freezing and preservation of every email, transaction receipt, and recorded phone call related to my parents. The net pulled tight simultaneously across 5 different corporate entities, trapping Victor and Elaine in a web of their own fraudulent transactions. The sudden flurry of high-level legal activity did not go unnoticed. A sharp investigative journalist from the city's most prominent independent newspaper caught the scent of the scandal. The premise was too juicy to ignore wealthy, heroic parents caught liquidating a comatose culinary star's empire. The reporter reached out to my studio for a comment. I agreed to meet her at a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop. I did not offer her tears. I did not give her a dramatic quote about familial betrayal or a broken heart. I slid a thick, black binder across the table. It contained the fully paid hospital invoices, proving my insurance covered the medical bills from day one. It contained the auction house receipts, showing that my grandmother June Calloway's antique emerald necklace was sold off to the highest bidder, not to buy me medicine, but merely days before Elaine placed a massive cash down payment on a luxury condo. I let the raw, undisputed documents tell the story. When the article dropped online, the public backlash was apocalyptic. The narrative shifted overnight. The thousands of online donors who had wept over Elaine's kitchen video realized they had been conned. The internet turned on my parents with terrifying speed. Comment sections flooded with demands for refunds, accusations of grand larceny, and calls for criminal investigations. The crushing weight of public humiliation finally broke Victor. The polished, soft-spoken manipulator vanished. My burner phone rang late on a Thursday night. I answered in silence, pressing the record button on a secondary device Mara had legally authorized for evidence collection. Victor's voice tore through the speaker. Ugly and vicious, the mask was completely gone. He screamed at me, calling me a pathetic, ungrateful child who owed him every ounce of success I had ever achieved. He threatened to drag my name through the mud, promising to destroy my studio and ruin my reputation permanently if I did not immediately call off the lawyers. I let him rage for 3 straight minutes. I did not utter a single syllable in response. When he finally ran out of breath, I quietly ended the call, saving the pristine, legally obtained audio file of his extortion attempt. Despite the crumbling reality around them, my mother's narcissism refused to yield. In a display of sheer, astonishing delusion, Elaine refused to cancel the massive charity gala she had spent weeks promoting using my brand. She genuinely believed that if she could just get on a stage, dressed in couture, and deliver a tearful speech about the Meals for Miracles Foundation, the wealthy elite of the city would embrace her. She thought she could outshine the impending legal indictments with a grand public spectacle. Mara Bell called me, her voice tight with urgency, ready to file a cease and desist to shut the venue down before the doors even opened. I told her to stand down. I did not want the gala canceled. Let the caterers serve the expensive champagne. Let the string quartet play. Let the high society donors fill the ballroom. And let Elaine step up to the microphone in her stolen spotlight. I had learned a long time ago that you never interrupt your enemy when they are making a fatal mistake. Sometimes, the most devastating trap you can lay is a beautiful, brightly lit stage that your opponent eagerly steps onto, completely unaware that the floorboards are about to give way. The air in Mara Bell's office felt electric on the morning of the gala. While my mother was busy approving floral arrangements and champagne vintages, the justice system was quietly pulling the floor out from under her. At 9 o'clock sharp, a district judge reviewed our compiled emergency motions and slammed a judicial freeze on every single bank account associated with Victor and Elaine Greenwood. The crowdfunding platform's residual balances, their personal checking, and the escrow account holding the Granby Fair Company advance were all locked down. Mara slid the final bound copy of our master lawsuit across her desk. It was thick enough to serve as a doorstop, an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. It did not rely on emotional appeals. It was built entirely on hard, undeniable statutes. Count 1 detailed the financial exploitation of an incapacitated adult. Count 2 outlined felony wire fraud through digital fundraising. Count 3 hit them with unauthorized asset transfer and intellectual property infringement. Count 4 dropped the hammer with false declaration in real estate transactions. They were not just facing my wrath anymore. Nolan Pierce had officially filed his own aggressive civil suit that very morning, demanding massive compensatory damages for title fraud and emotional distress. My parents had spent weeks positioning themselves as the proactive heroes of my tragedy. Now, they were entirely surrounded, taking devastating incoming fire from a coalition they had inadvertently created. The final piece of the evidentiary puzzle had arrived by secure courier 2 days prior. The regional auction house, terrified of being implicated in fencing stolen goods, completely flipped. They willingly surrendered the complete, itemized sales manifests. Right there in black and white was the proof that they had auctioned off June Calloway's antique silver service and heirloom jewelry. They had sold items explicitly protected under my grandmother's will, violating the very core of estate law. Mara had meticulously mapped every piece of evidence onto a massive timeline board in her conference room. The ex-assistant's damning voicemail sat right next to Elaine's frantic text messages. The illegal contracts signed with Granby Fair Company aligned perfectly with the dates my insurance company had already issued full coverage statements. And overarching it all was the 14-year-old renunciation agreement Victor had signed, proving he knew he possessed zero legal authority over my inheritance. It was an airtight, suffocating chronology of pure greed. They had nowhere to run. By 8 o'clock that evening, the grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a vision of forced elegance. I sat in a sleek, unmarked black sedan idling across the street, watching the wealthy elite of the city arrive in their evening wear. Through the tinted windows, I could see the warm glow of the chandeliers and hear the faint, soaring notes of a hired string quartet playing classical music. A massive, professionally designed banner hung above the entrance, welcoming guests to the Meals for Miracles Foundation Gala, proudly hosted by the Greenwood family. It was a breathtaking monument to their delusion. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, completely oblivious to the drop. I checked my watch. The timing had to be surgical. I waited until the guests were seated and the introductory speeches began. I stepped out of the car. I was not wearing the brightly colored, heavily styled outfits Elaine always preferred me to wear for press events. I wore a tailored, unadorned black dress that fell just below my knees. The neckline dipped just low enough to reveal the faint, fading purple scar of the central venous catheter on my collarbone, a quiet testament to the hell my body had survived. I wore no jewelry. I wore no heavy makeup. I did not need armor. I was the weapon. I walked through the gilded revolving doors of the hotel lobby. Just ahead of me, Mara Bell was already coordinating with the designated strike team. 2 uniformed court process servers, a senior representative from the crowdfunding platform's fraud division, and Nolan Pierce's lead litigator were waiting by the velvet ropes. Inside the ballroom, Elaine was standing at the podium, bathed in a warm spotlight. I slipped through the heavy mahogany doors and stood in the shadows at the very back of the room, completely unnoticed by the crowd. My mother was delivering a tearful, practiced monologue about the unbearable weight of a parent's love and the miraculous power of community support. Near the edge of the stage, Victor was aggressively swirling a glass of scotch, playing the part of the stoic patriarch, but his performance shattered in an instant. An event coordinator, pale and trembling, scurried out from the wings and grabbed Victor's arm. The young woman leaned in and frantically whispered into his ear, pointing nervously toward the main lobby doors. I watched the exact second Victor Greenwood's world ended. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The expensive scotch sloshed over the rim of his glass and stained his tuxedo cuffs. He looked frantically toward the exit, knowing the authorities were waiting just on the other side of the wall, up at the podium. Elaine was entirely oblivious to her husband's panic. She flashed a trembling, brave smile at the flashing cameras, raising her hands to accept the applause from the wealthy donors she had just defrauded. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. I simply stepped out from the shadows and walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. My heels clicked softly against the polished hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic cadence cutting through the dying applause. One by one, the guests sitting at the aisle tables turned their heads. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they recognized the woman they had supposedly gathered to mourn. The whispering spread like wildfire, a chaotic wave of confusion sweeping toward the front of the room. Elaine heard the commotion. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her professional smile froze, turning brittle and grotesque as she lowered her hands. She squinted against the bright stage lights, trying to see what was disrupting her perfect moment. I stopped walking exactly 10 feet from the stage. The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. Hundreds of eyes darted between the weeping mother at the microphone and the daughter standing right in front of her. I stood perfectly straight. I did not look like a fragile victim who had just crawled out of an intensive care unit. I looked like a reckoning. I locked eyes with my mother, watching the utter terror finally snap her manufactured reality in two. Beside the stage, Victor dropped his glass, the crystal shattering loudly against the floor. In that frozen, agonizing moment, as the authorities waited in the hall and the stolen money vanished from their frozen accounts, the ultimate truth crashed down upon them. My parents stared at me, finally realizing that the real tragedy of this entire ordeal was not the fact that their daughter had almost died. The tragedy was that she had lived. I did not scream. I did not flip tables or snatch the microphone from my mother's trembling hands. True power does not need to raise its voice. I simply stood at the edge of the stage and watched the illusion shatter. Behind me, the heavy mahogany ballroom doors swung wide open. The smartly dressed process servers and the fraud investigators I had stationed in the lobby walked smoothly down the center aisle. Right there, in front of the city's wealthiest philanthropists, the servers handed Victor and Elaine thick stacks of legal manila folders. There were court orders, massive asset freeze notifications, official demands for the immediate return of the fraudulently raised funds, and criminal subpoenas. The flashbulbs of the local press, originally hired by my mother to document her triumph, instead captured the exact second my parents were legally dismantled. The string quartet stopped playing. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving them to drown in the deafening whispers of their ruined reputation. The civil trial that followed 3 months later was not a spectacle of tears or dramatic emotional pleas. Mara Bell built her entire strategy on the one thing that suffocates a liar faster than anything else. She used a suffocating, unbroken chain of verified documents. She stood before the judge and laid out the anatomy of a robbery disguised as a rescue. The medical files proved my parents possessed only a temporary healthcare proxy, a document that strictly limited them to medical choices. It granted absolutely zero authority to authorize real estate transfers, liquidate inherited physical assets, or monetize my medical trauma. The paperwork painted a flawless portrait of blatant profiteering. Mara presented the predatory corporate licensing agreement, the digital logs showing hundreds of thousands of dollars moving from the charity platform directly into their personal checking accounts, and the zero-balance medical invoices proving my health coverage had handled everything from day one. Then came the parade of witnesses. Nolan Pierce took the stand, his voice tight with anger, testifying that Victor had aggressively rushed the house sale while deliberately hiding vital structural information. The director of the auction house confirmed under oath that Elaine had submitted my grandmother's jewelry with legally falsified ownership affidavits. My mother's former assistant pressed play on the audio recording of Elaine eagerly anticipating my permanent incapacitation. Finally, my lead neurologist testified, confirming my complete cognitive recovery and absolute mental clarity. Victor and Elaine sat at the defense table, looking hollowed out and gray. They knew they were going to lose the civil suit. They knew they would have to pay back the stolen cash and return the physical items. But they were still clinging to a sliver of arrogance, privately comforting themselves with the knowledge that they still had their deferred retirement trust waiting for them in the wider family estate. That is when Mara Bell delivered the execution protocol. She approached the bench and submitted the sealed, notarized addendum from June Calloway's final will. The courtroom went entirely silent as Mara read my grandmother's conditional clause aloud. The legal language was absolute. It stated that if any family member exploited a period of my medical or mental vulnerability to seize, transfer, or profit from my assets, they would immediately forfeit their entire remaining share of the inherited estate. Furthermore, that forfeited share would automatically and irrevocably transfer directly into my sole possession. I watched my father's chest cave in. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. The twist annihilated their final safety net. They were not just facing total restitution and a devastating civil judgment. They had just lost the wealth they had spent their entire lives waiting to inherit. Their greed had literally bankrupted their future. The judge did not show an ounce of leniency. The court ordered the immediate return of all recoverable physical assets, mandated crippling financial compensation for the damage done to my corporate reputation, and officially transferred the entire charity fraud dossier to the state prosecutor for immediate criminal indictment. When the gavel fell, it sounded like a vault locking shut. I walked out into the marble hallway of the courthouse. I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Victor and Elaine tried to intercept me near the elevators. They looked small, broken, and desperate. "Autumn, please," Elaine whispered, reaching a trembling hand out toward my sleeve. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I stepped back, out of her reach. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world and saw nothing but strangers. "You made one fundamental miscalculation your entire lives," I said, my voice as calm and cold as a winter river. "You thought love meant ownership. You thought giving me life meant you owned the rights to it. I just proved in a court of law that I am no one's property." I turned my back on them and stepped into the elevator, leaving them standing alone in the cold marble corridor. That evening, I returned to Charleston. The house was quiet, still bearing the scars of their hasty looting, but it was mine again. I walked into the sprawling kitchen. The evening light filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the reclaimed brick and the butcher block island. I walked past the empty spaces where my copper pots used to hang and stopped in front of the dry goods pantry. I pressed my hand against the dark walnut paneling. The magnetic lock clicked, and the secret door smoothly slid open. I did not step inside. I just stood there, looking into the dark, secure space. For 16 years, that hidden room had been a monument to my anxiety. It was a shelter built out of a deep, lingering fear that the people who were supposed to protect me would eventually try to destroy me. But as I looked at the empty shelves where the vital documents had rested, the fear was entirely gone. The secret behind the kitchen was no longer a hiding place. It was the vault where I had stored the exact ammunition needed for the day I finally decided that I would never again survive in silence. I pressed the mechanism, watched the heavy wall slide shut, and turned back to my kitchen to start rebuilding my empire. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Helena Revenge Stories, leave a like on the video, and support the channel even more by hitting the like button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.